I'd like to now go through some of the reasons why this sutta is considered very important and held in such high regard. There'll be some sutta references that we can also look at. I'd like to go through one of the verses of the Buddha which appears in the Dhammapada, and it's number 76, and it's known as the Radhathera Vatu. And this is the story about Radhathera, and he was residing at the Jetavana monastery, and the Buddha uttered this particular verse in reference to Radhathera, who was at that time a poor old Brahmin. So Radha stayed in the monastery doing small services for the bhikkhus, and for his services he was provided with food and clothing and other needs, but he wasn't encouraged to join the order of the Sangha, although he had a very strong desire to become a bhikkhu himself. Now one day early in the morning, when the Buddha surveyed the world with his supernormal power, he saw the poor Brahmin in his vision, and he knew that he was due for arahantship. So the Buddha went to the old man and learned from him that the bhikkhus of Jetavana monastery did not want him to join the order. The Buddha then called all the bhikkhus to him, and he asked them, "Is there any bhikkhu here who recollects any good turn done to him by this old man?" And to this question the Venerable Sariputta replied, "Venerable Sir, I do recollect an instance when this old man offered me a spoonful of rice." Then the Buddha said, "If that be so, shouldn't you help your benefactor to get liberated from the ills of life?" Then Venerable Sariputta agreed to make the old man a bhikkhu, and he was duly admitted to the order of the Sangha. Then Venerable Sariputta guided the old bhikkhu, and the old bhikkhu strictly followed his guidance. Within a few days, he became a arahant. Now, when the Buddha next came to see the bhikkhus, they reported to him how strictly the old bhikkhu followed the guidance of Venerable Sariputta. To them, the Buddha replied that a bhikkhu should be amenable to guidance like Radha, not resent when rebuked for any fault or failing. And then the Buddha spoke in verse, and the verse goes, "One should find and associate with a learned and wise person who sees one's faults and speaks reprovingly, just as a guide to some hidden treasure. It is better for one to associate with such a person, not worse." So clearly the Buddha here is emphasizing that if someone points out your faults, someone gives you feedback, someone admonishes you, someone gives you instruction or guidance, you should view that as if someone's pointing out or guiding you to a hidden treasure. And I guess the failings, the faults, the misdeeds, the defilements, those are the hidden treasure, because if one continues to hold on to defilements, continues to ignore misdeeds and things of that nature, then clearly one can't progress, one can't develop. And Radhathera's story gives us a clear example of someone who's old and probably not very good means at the time. Even under the guidance of a good teacher or being given the right feedback, one can develop and grow and understand the Dhamma. Another good sutta reference comes from the Dasuttara Sutta, which is a discourse on up to tens, and you find that in the Digha Nikaya, and it's discourse number 34. There's a statement in the chapter of twos which says, "Which two things lead to the progress or distinction in Dhamma?" And that's known as Dhamma Visesa Bhagya. And the answer that's given is being easy to admonish, suvaco, and having morally good friendships, kalyana mitata. And those are the two things that lead to progress or distinction. Now, what is really interesting about this is that link between easy to admonish and having morally good friendships. In this Anumana Sutta, what Venerable Mahamoggallana will be promoting is that if you are easy to admonish, then you build trust, you foster trust with your spiritual companions. They see that you follow the good teaching, you follow guidance, instruction, and even try to resolve bad qualities and defilements and that sort of thing. And so you can see the interchange, that if you are easy to admonish, you foster trust. If you foster trust, you sustain morally good friendships, like good spiritual friendships, and vice versa. So you can see the parallel in this, and it's something to really contemplate as we go through even Anumana Sutta. After hearing the words of the Buddha in the Radhathera Vatu and the story of Radhathera, you can already see why the teaching in the Anumana Sutta is so important and can be very beneficial to us, because the Anumana Sutta highlights in detail what obstructs us. And what obstructs us? Well, these are the qualities that obstructs us from understanding Dhamma. It obstructs us from being able to be taught or instructed in the Dhamma by noble beings or learned people. It also obstructs us from making progress on the Noble Eightfold Path, on the path set by the Buddha. And also within the sutta, it highlights where if you're unable to take feedback or instruction in Dhamma, if you're unable to be admonished for one's faults, then it makes it very difficult for people to trust you when you keep cultivating unwholesome qualities. And so that puts extra pressure on harmony with others, whether it's in Dhamma community, Dhamma circles, Dhamma groups, and even with Kalyanamitta. People tend to trust more when you're able to take advice, to take feedback, to see that advice, that feedback as a blessing towards one's practice, that someone is trying to help you to overcome defilements, to overcome what is hindering your path. Now, when one is unable to do so, then what happens is trust declines, and then also harmony with others also declines. So what Anumana Sutta provides is something that can be very, very beneficial to us. It clearly gives us a clear method for removing obstructions and a means for assessing or taking measure of oneself. And when one is able to take measure of oneself, then you can actually look at those areas for improvement, for making progress. And of course, Venerable Mahamoggallana, he emphasizes regular review because it's not a one-off thing. In order to progress on the path, whether you want to progress quickly, if you want to progress quickly, it's good to be able to see where one is falling down. And so if you regularly receive instruction or admonishment from spiritual friends and guides, then what happens is that can become very useful. And when you do that regular review oneself, then it becomes a self-knowledge, a self-correcting mechanism, and that can quicken progress on the path. This is also supported in the Anangana Sutta, which is on blemishes, and this is a conversation between Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahamoggallana, looking at those that receive feedback on blemishes, those that can actually assess for oneself. And what Venerable Sariputta highlights in his discussion with Venerable Mahamoggallana is that self-knowledge aids spiritual progress, that if one can actually see and make an assessment for oneself and can actually correct unwholesome qualities or defilements, then one can actually make progress on the path. The other thing that appears is within the Anguttara Nikaya, there's a teaching within chapter 4, Discourse 160, and that's around the persistence and continuation and endurance of the Dhamma, that if we cultivate in accordance with this particular teaching and other teachings of the Buddha, other teachings of the Arahants, then if we are cultivating in this way, if we are diligent, if we are open to feedback, to admonishment, then it is something that leads to the continuation of the Dhamma, the persistence and the endurance of the Dhamma. But if we don't, then the opposite is true. It would lead to the decline, the non-endurance of the teaching. Now, most of us have also been developing metta or cultivating metta. And if you know the Karaniya metta sutta, then you will know that suvacha or suvaco, the easy to instruct, easy to admonish, easy to give feedback to, this is a quality that is a prerequisite for developing metta. It actually goes on to be a prerequisite for muddu, if you remember in the sutta, which is the gentleness. That if we don't have this particular quality, then we fall short of being able to cultivate metta. So it becomes very, very important as something towards growing in our meditation practice, growing in our cultivation of good qualities. When you look at a teaching of the Buddha or a teaching of one of the Arahants, it's always good to look for repetition throughout the Sutta Pitaka to actually see that there are repetitions in the types of teaching, that it's not just a one-off, that it's not something that is obscure. And what you find with the Anumana Sutta is that there are multiple teachings within the Sutta Pitaka that support this particular teaching, and similar words, similar advice that is being given by both Buddha and other Arahats, very similar to what Venerable Mahamoggallana says in this particular sutta. There are quite a few suttas that intersect with the Anumana Sutta and literally support the Anumana Sutta. I won't go through all of them, but the ones that we already know are, like I mentioned before, the Anangana Sutta, that's in Majjhima Nikaya, Discourse number 5, and that's about blemishes. That's the one about Venerable Sariputta and Venerable Mahamoggallana talking about how it's important to review one's blemishes and what's the distinction between an inferior person and a superior person, and that being that the superior person tries to understand where the blemishes are in order to overcome them, and therefore that makes, the self-knowledge of that and the correction of it makes one advance on the spiritual path. Then you have the Vatupama Sutta, which we all know is the Discourse on the Simile of the Cloth. That's Majjhima Nikaya number 7. And that's really all about defilements. And there's a convergence between this particular sutta and the qualities that Venerable Mahamoggallana lists out, which are very similar to some of the list of the 16 that Buddha gives in this Vatupama Sutta. Then you also have the Saleka Sutta, which is about self-effacement, and that's the one after Vatupama Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. And again, this is a list of qualities, and Buddha gives the way of actually overcoming those particular qualities. So that's quite a useful one as well. But there are many, many others where Buddha and the Arahants are alluding to what it takes on this training path and the importance of being able to receive feedback, just like Venerable Radha, the poor Brahmin, and being able to actually take guidance, take instruction, because it's always beneficial for the path, and it's also beneficial to even to understand the teachings of the Buddha.